The American Civil War began and escalated because slavery had become both a sprawling economic system and a political engine. Since the Revolution, the United States had repeatedly tried to manage slavery's expansion with compromises that postponed conflict while raising the stakes. The line of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the uneasy bargains of the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act's opening of popular sovereignty, and the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision all widened the gap. It created a massive divide between a growing anti-slavery coalition in the North and a slaveholding political class that increasingly demanded federal protection for slavery everywhere it might expand. By the time Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 with the newly formed Republican Party, a Northern coalition dedicated to halting the expansion of the institution, many white Southern leaders interpreted the result as a structural threat. With the country still navigating the transfer of power, James Buchanan, a lame duck president, did nothing to stop the unfolding constitutional crisis. With the inauguration still months away, South Carolina seceded first. Within weeks, several more Deep South states followed. By February 1861, delegates met at Montgomery, Alabama, to form a Confederate government, and Jefferson Davis became president. At its heart, the Confederacy's foundation rested upon black inequality and slavery as a natural condition. Initially, the Confederacy sought independence without a full-scale war. But as Lincoln made it clear that the Constitution created a perpetual union, the South prepared to fight long enough to fracture Northern will and force recognition of its nationhood. Meanwhile, the Union's approach was inherently offensive to preserve the Union. It had to restore federal authority over an enormous hostile area, defeat Confederate field armies that could retreat on interior lines, and keep the Northern electorate committed long enough for strategy, institutions, and logistics to mature. While the seceded states seized federal property in many places, the most combustible flashpoint became Fort Sumter. As Union Major Robert Anderson refused to surrender, Confederate batteries fired the first shots of the war on April 12, 1861. Lincoln responded by calling forth a militia of 75,000 men, and later that month issued a blockade proclamation to strangle Confederate trade. The first land operations occurred in northwestern Virginia, where pro-Union residents sought to secede from the Confederacy. Union General George B. McClellan won a series of small but significant victories, paving the way for West Virginia to be admitted to the Union in 1863. The first major land clash happened on July 21, 1861, at the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas. There, Union General Irvin McDowell's 28,000 Green troops initially pushed back the Confederates. However, a staunch defense led by Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who earned the legendary moniker Stonewall during this engagement, halted the Federal advance. Confederate reinforcements under Joseph E. Johnston arrived, bringing their numbers to 32,000, and turned the Union retreat into a chaotic route back to Washington. The psychological impact was profound. It shattered the Northern illusion of a quick, bloodless war and instilled a sense of overconfidence in the South, creating a myth that one rebel was worth 10 Yankees. Following the defeat, George B. McClellan replaced McDowell and began the arduous task of organizing the Army of the Potomac. By 1862, the war had expanded into multiple theaters, demanding vast logistical operations and introducing new technologies. In the Western Theater, the Union sought to gain control of the major river systems. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant, supported by federal gunboats, captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in early 1862, inflicting over 16,000 casualties and providing the North with its first significant strategic successes. This momentum culminated in the Battle of Shiloh on April 6, 1862, when Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive surprise attack against Grant's encampment at Pittsburg Landing in Tennessee. Although the Union Army was nearly driven into the river on the first day, and Johnston was mortally wounded at the height of his success, Grant was reinforced by Don Carlos Buell's 20,000 troops. Grant launched a successful counterattack on the second day, forcing a Confederate retreat. The battle resulted in staggering casualties, over 13,000 Union and 10,694 Confederate, immobilizing both sides for weeks. Western operations continued late into the year, with major engagements at Perryville and the bloody Battle of Stones River, where Union General William S. Rosecrans forced Braxton Bragg to retreat despite suffering nearly 13,000 Union casualties. Simultaneously, the nature of naval warfare was forever altered. In an effort to break the Union's coastal blockade, the Confederacy constructed ironclad warships. On March 9, 1862, the world witnessed the first battle between ironclads when the Confederate Virginia clashed with the Union's Monitor at Hampton Roads. Though a tactical draw, it rendered wooden navies obsolete overnight. Back in the Eastern Theater, Union General George B. McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, an amphibious operation aimed at capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond. Despite possessing a massive numerical advantage, McClellan's chronic hesitation and constant overestimation of enemy strength allowed Confederate General Robert E. Lee to assume command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee aggressively pushed McClellan back during the 7 days battles, saving Richmond and shifting the strategic momentum. Emboldened, Lee moved his army north into Maryland in September, seeking to bring the war to federal soil, influence Northern elections, and impress European powers. This invasion culminated on September 17, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam remains the deadliest single day in American military history, with 12,401 Union and 10,316 Confederate casualties. While tactically a draw, Lee was forced to retreat across the Potomac, giving President Lincoln the political space to announce emancipation as a fit and necessary war measure. Since the beginning of the war, enslaved people, though never armed in the South, became the labor backbone that kept the Confederate war machine functioning through transportation, supply movement, fortification building, food production, and camp support. Their liberation would not only destroy Southern logistics, but would add hundreds of thousands of new soldiers to the Union lines, shifting the balance of the conflict. By the end of the war, roughly 179,000 black men served as soldiers in the U.S. Army, and about 19,000 in the Navy, with nearly 40,000 dying during the conflict. When emancipation became official federal policy in January 1863, it permanently liberated all the approximately 4 million enslaved persons in rebellious territories. Once African Americans spilled blood to save the country, there was no turning back in recognizing their humanity. Prior to this, the North's primary goal was the preservation of the Union. Now, it was a moral crusade. In the diplomatic arena, it isolated the Confederacy, wiping away any chances of being recognized by European powers, as the anti-slavery sentiments of the European public made it politically impossible. Disappointed in McClellan for failing to pursue Lee after Antietam, Lincoln removed him and put Ambrose Burnside in command. The result was the Battle of Fredericksburg, where repeated Union assaults against entrenched Confederate positions produced a lopsided slaughter and demoralized the North. This battle showed both armies that the Army of the Potomac could not simply walk to Richmond. It must outmaneuver or grind down the Army of Northern Virginia. Burnside's removal and Lincoln's appointment of General Joseph Hooker was the next decision node. The next encounter would be at Chancellorsville, where General Robert E. Lee defeated a much larger Union army with audacity, surprise, and aggressive maneuvering, despite being outnumbered more than 2-1. This extremely rare feat in modern warfare was Lee's masterpiece. Instead of following conventional wisdom, Lee split his numerically inferior army, leaving a small force to hold Hooker while sending Stonewall Jackson on a massive flanking march. It worked, but Jackson was mortally wounded, depriving the Confederacy of one of its most skilled commanders, a loss Lee later described in personal terms. The result of this battle emboldened Lee to invade Pennsylvania to politically hurt the Union, forcing Lincoln to replace Hooker with George G. Meade. The armies unexpectedly collided at the crossroads town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. Unfolding over 3 days of staggering violence, it became the greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The defensive positions of the Union fiercely halted the Confederate advance for 2 days. On the third day, Lee ordered a massive, nearly suicidal frontal assault that resulted in an almost 60% casualty rate for the attackers. Lee was forced to retreat, having lost over 28,000 men, irreplaceable veteran soldiers and officers. He would never mount a major offensive into Northern territory again. Despite the victory, Lincoln lamented that Meade let Lee move away at his leisure, calling the missed chance a golden opportunity. This created an opening for the next great general of the Union to take command. While the East churned through commanders, the West began to produce what Lincoln needed, not just victories, but victories with systemic meaning. General Ulysses S. Grant executed a masterful campaign to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, known as the Gibraltar of the West. Frustrated by the city's natural defenses and failing in earlier bayou expeditions, Grant boldly moved his army south of the city, crossed the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, and won a series of inland battles to sever Vicksburg's supply lines. He then enveloped the city, initiating a grueling 47-day siege. The starving Confederate defenders, numbering 31,000 under John C. Pemberton, finally surrendered on July 4, 1863. The fall of Vicksburg, coupled with the surrender of Port Hudson 5 days later, gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, permanently splitting the Confederacy in half. Later that year, Union victories at Chattanooga under Grant further secured the West, driving Bragg's Confederate Army into Georgia. In March 1864, President Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant to Lieutenant General and General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant immediately implemented a synchronized grand strategy. He would move the Army of the Potomac against Lee in Virginia, while William Tecumseh Sherman marched against Joseph E. Johnston and the industrial hub of Atlanta. Grant personally accompanied the Army of the Potomac in the Overland Campaign, a relentless, grinding offensive. Despite suffering horrific casualties, over 17,000 in the wilderness, over 18,000 in savage hand-to-hand combat at the Bloody Angle of Spotsylvania, and nearly 13,000 in a disastrous frontal assault at Cold Harbor, Grant refused to retreat. Instead of falling back to Washington as previous commanders had done, he continually swung his army south, eventually crossing the James River on a 2,200-foot pontoon bridge to attack Petersburg, the critical railroad hub supplying Richmond. When the initial assaults on Petersburg failed, the conflict evolved into a grueling 9-month siege characterized by 30 miles of muddy trench warfare. While Grant held Lee in a death grip at Petersburg, General William Tecumseh Sherman initiated his Atlanta campaign, executing flanking maneuvers that forced Confederate forces to evacuate the city in September 1864. Following this victory, Sherman implemented a devastating psychological and economic strategy known as hard war. Convinced that he had to crush the will of white Southern civilians to end the rebellion, Sherman abandoned his supply lines and launched his march to the sea. Marching 62,000 men from Atlanta to Savannah, his army cut a 50-mile-wide swath of destruction, destroying railroads, burning warehouses, and laying waste to crops. By targeting the economic infrastructure, Sherman sought to prove that the Confederate government was utterly powerless to protect its citizens. Although his troops generally avoided killing civilians, the psychological terror inflicted by foragers and stragglers broke the Southern spirit, leading to massive desertions from Lee's army. Sherman's forces inflicted an estimated $100 million in damage in Georgia alone, before turning north to inflict even greater punitive destruction upon South Carolina. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate war machine had completely collapsed. On April 2nd, Grant finally broke the Petersburg lines, forcing Lee to evacuate both Petersburg and Richmond. As Confederate forces fled the capital, they set fire to tobacco warehouses, inadvertently burning much of the city they had defended for 4 years. On April 4th, just 2 days after the evacuation, President Lincoln arrived in Richmond. Accompanied by his son Tad and a small military escort, Lincoln walked the smoldering cobblestone streets, visiting Libby Prison and the Confederate capital. He was quickly surrounded by a jubilant crowd of newly emancipated African Americans, one of whom reportedly shouted, "Jesus Christ has come at last!" It was a profound, symbolic moment of triumph and liberation. Lee's retreating army, starving and continually harassed by Union cavalry, found itself trapped near the village of Appomattox Court House. On April 9, 1865, recognizing the futility of further resistance, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. The American Civil War was the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, resulting in an estimated 625,000 military deaths and 225,000 civilian casualties, bringing the total human toll to an astounding 850,000. Yet the end of fighting on the battlefield marked the beginning of a complex, tragic, and politically violent era known as Reconstruction. In a grim prelude to that period, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Thanks for watching. If this journey through the battlefields and turning points of the Civil War gave you a fresh perspective on the conflict that forever changed the nation, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.